The Mask of Command. The Mask of Command, a study of generalship, a book by John Keegan, was a book that was on the recommended reading list back when I was a lieutenant for officer professional development. Did we all read it? Some did. Some just picked it up and carry it around. Now, this was a book that today you can go up on the internet and grab a copy of a PDF file on it. Go out and purchase it online on Amazon for under $5 if you search for a good bargain. But why pay for it when you can get it for free? Like the vaccines, right? Work smarter, not harder. Imagine a bunch of butter bar lieutenants and ensigns at the very beginning of their careers, military officers, going out to read a book to learn how to act like a general in their leadership style. Studying Alexander the Great, Wellington, Grant, and even Hitler. And being told that leadership, believe it or not, is only just a mask, a false face. Looking like you are in charge and knowing what you are doing so as to inspire others to follow you. And that actually is a big part of what we call leadership style. But to those who tend to be the most successful at leadership, they tend to be able to use that mask to enable them to inspire their subordinates to achieve results. A wonderful story about George Washington crossing the Delaware. And it is a fact that no matter how you obtain your commission, be it ROTC, a service academy, or even OCS, only 2% of lieutenants will ever pin on a general star. And if the only thing that you had to do was fake it until you make it, everyone would one day become a general, which is obviously not the case. And a lot of that attrition comes from bad choices that tend to limit career options. Sometimes character traits that people just aren't able to control. Self-discipline. Because they say a novel coronavirus through natural selection has acquired gains of function to enable it to mass an attack. In the military process of identifying the winners and losers, we kind of act like those guys in a schoolyard getting ready to play a game of softball or on a basketball court, and choose those players who are going to help us win the game in the end. And if you don't have the right stuff, you're not ever going to play with the superstars. Dream all you want. As we chose this title, The Mask of Command, because we just passed through the Halloween holiday. And for the second Halloween in pandemic, I decided to be a big-time attorney and walked over to the Supreme Court to file a petition for certiorari in our facial coverings mandate challenge, the first and longest surviving facial coverings challenge, certainly in Virginia, probably America. And the topic of what many are calling masks, but technically aren't, has become quite a topic of discussion for school boards across the nation. And I happen to be a candidate in a school board race in a community with the most government scientists in the nation. So let's just say that the attorney mask just seemed to be a proper fit. Hello, my name is Major Mike Webb. For about 2 decades, I wore the uniform of a soldier in the U.S. Army, a kind of costume, with about 5 years on active duty and the rest, as some might describe, as a weekend warrior, serving in the reserve component forces of the U.S. Army Reserve and the National Guard. And for those familiar with the defense establishment lingo, you can say over the course of 2 decades, I was engaged in both the Title 10 Army, generally associated with maneuver forces, as well as the Title 50 Army, which is generally associated with intelligence activities. But I like to say I spent my time engaged in the business of force projection, or deploying assets to address rapidly developing tendencies around the world, and in force protection, or simply stated, ensuring survivability of those assets, to include our men and women in uniform to complete the assigned mission and return home to their families and normal lives. I didn't plan to become a millionaire doing it, and certainly did not become one by accident. But I certainly had a lot of fun doing it. And right now, you have a pandemic. So let's, for the next few minutes, talk about your masks and why I, as a retired military leader and member of the intelligence community in retirement, say that they don't work. Or to use the term, are not battle effective, even if they may provide feelings of efficacy and empowerment. just as former Army surgeon Ralph Northam was certain that they would, based upon documents that we had obtained through some intelligence collection in preparation of the battlefield that has become a protracted battle, in a battle that now has landed us a beachhead of the United States Supreme Court. Very early on in the facial coverings debate, a certain, shall we say, expert who distinguished himself as the Virginia governor was planning to mandate the wearing of non-medical grade facial coverings by the name of Stuart Harris, who wears the mask of a constitutional law expert in Johnson City, Tennessee. As a frequent legal commentator at WJHL, Independent Channel 11, local affiliate to no major network, broadcasting to what they call the Tri-City area. And I will let your imagination consider the other two cities near Johnson City that make it a Tri-City area on the border of Virginia and Tennessee. Harris is an employee at the Lincoln Memorial University School of Law, or Duncan School of Law, which is ranked nationally at the top 147th of 193 law schools. So just above the bottom 25% ranked nationally. But probably the best law school in Johnson City, Tennessee, Tri-City area. And for some in Virginia, he introduced a very important Supreme Court case in his hat as a constitutional law expert, although his job description on the website is that he is the specialist for large donations at the law school. But he introduced us to the Jacobson v. Massachusetts case, a 1905 opinion that was penned by Justice John Marshall Harlan, a case arising from a vaccines mandate in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and involving Pastor Henning Jacobson, a Swedish immigrant and pastor of the Faith Lutheran Church that you can still visit today, and I did. And if you were to read the case brought by his attorneys, Frederick H. Nash and Herbert Parker, to the Supreme Court, you would learn pretty quickly that he had been arrested and fined $5, or about $120 a day, because of his refusal to be administered a free vaccine being offered by the city government to address a smallpox crisis in that community. Now, certainly, Pastor Jacobson can fairly be described as one determined individual, because he took the position that the city could throw him in jail, which they certainly threatened, because he was not going to accept a free vaccine, and refused to pay the fine, and took his case all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And probably quite a few of us, as they call anti-vaxxers, may find some simpatico with Pastor Jacobson and his determination and obstinacy, standing up for his rights, and that is important. And one of his driving motivations had been that while he was a child in Sweden, the government had forced him to be administered a vaccine from which he had suffered an adverse event that affected him pretty seriously. And that childhood trauma was certainly sufficient enough for him to develop what would become a lifelong resolution. But his thought, or passion, a lot of people want passion, became rigid, applying that single emotional experience to develop a general rule that because he had a tragic experience with one vaccine, then therefore, at least in his mind, all vaccines of necessity had to be bad. Ever play baseball as a kid? Did you hit the ball out the park the first time? Did you even make contact with the ball? Probably not. Even harder sometimes in golf. You have to have a special stance, special swing, keep your eye on the ball. And in science, we try to apply a method of attempting to replicate results through experimentation to refine a hypothesis, a working hypothesis, until we can only then develop a general rule that can be elevated to what we like to describe as a theory, or even a law, like the laws of gravity. Unfortunately for Reverend Jacobson, however, he also had another idea that all attorneys were good, like some people believe that all vaccines are good, and not just a couple of slicksters who were happy to take his money. and they gladly accepted the good reverend's case and his money. And rather than developing a case that might actually be effective at gaining him a victory, they took his ill-conceived notions to include a farcical idea that he somehow had rights guaranteed in the preamble, all the way to the United States Supreme Court. He was a Swedish immigrant with a lingering childhood trauma, and I am pretty certain that at least in his mind, at the very end, he had fought a good fight that certainly was efficacious, in that it certainly produced an immune response from the government he was fighting, since they sent the police and then sent their attorneys to fight him in court. But his misconceptions about what might actually be effective was a plan that could only fail. You don't want to be that guy sitting there saying, I should have taken the vaccine on television. And if a novel coronavirus has taught us anything about natural selection, a notion developed by Charles Darwin that rejects creationism, it is that you can be a single strand of RNA with an effective plan, even with no brain, and conquer the world. So the question is whether your masking plan that the president had thought in error during his campaign would end the pandemic within months after he became president. If only there was a national mandate, is an effective plan. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. But what if your plan is bad? Well, let's take a good look at the evidence. Back in June of 2020, Ben Guarino, Chelsea James, and Ariana Yoon-Jung-cha, who had become pandemic reporters at the Washington Post, wrote that months of discord about the coronavirus epidemic have transformed the cloth mask into a potent political symbol, touted by Democrats as a key part of communal responsibility, labeled by some GOP leaders as a sign of government overreach, and as a scarlet letter pinned on the week. And now let's just pause for a moment to apply our critical reading and thinking skills. And I want you to look at these arguments that are being advanced by our Democrats and our Republicans. Look at both sides. And I want you to identify which one of these groups is the Pastor Jacobson in this scenario. Well, if you read Blue Virginia, the GOP leaders who see a mask as a sign of government overreach is a no-brainer because it has no situational awareness of a public health crisis that has claimed the lives of over 5 million people worldwide, right? Over 750,000 Americans. Over 12,000 Virginians. Why would they be so blind and bent on liberty, right, when people are dying? And that could probably be easily applied to those who see a mask as a sign of weakness. Maybe they plan to develop natural immunity, which is a new argument being raised by some who have refused the vaccine. But let's be open-minded and take a good look as a scientist to consider these Democrats who see facial coverings is a key part of communal responsibility, a duty, do the right thing. It all certainly sounds good, but for a moment, let's try to be scientists and think like scientists. Have you ever known anybody who sang in a choir and actually believed that they were a fantastic singer? Maybe their mama told them that they could sing. Have you ever known somebody who believed they could do impersonations, but whoever they were trying to impersonate did not sound to you like the person they believed they had nailed to the minutest detail? Have you ever known somebody who was a legend in their own mind? What do they lack to disabuse them of this notion? A little evolutionary pressure, right? A little constructive criticism. You think Reverend Jacobson could have used a friend before he got to the Supreme Court to tell him he was going about what he wanted to do the wrong way? Or maybe his friends were afraid to hurt his little feelings and rather just let him go on out there and make a fool of himself. And look at what we have now, a decision at the Supreme Court that is being used to close businesses, schools, churches, and libraries and make us wear these facial coverings that they say actually cause children serious problems at forming relationships because their little minds are not as developed as adults. and they tend to get very confused when trying to identify someone by just their eyes. In kindergarten at my grammar school, we had a very popular teacher who everybody knew, who would actually fool the kids at Christmas time when he put on a red suit, some white hair, and a white beard, because they were not prepared for those advanced concepts in socialization. And so for them, he became Santa Claus. And so a part of this communal responsibility may not just be to do what is called the right thing, but also to make certain that what we are calling the right thing is being done in the right way and will actually be effective as the right thing. In August 2020, the CDC had to resort to a cartoonist to tell adults that they were wearing the facial coverings wrong, and had to explain to adults exactly what parts of their bodies had to be covered during an upper respiratory tract infection, public health crisis, nose and mouth. And those were adults who thought that they were being compliant and doing the right thing. Ever notice that you were driving too fast when you spotted a police car on the side of the road and decided to slow down? We're not always perfect. It happens. Catch it, check it, change it. They actually teach that to persons who have mental health problems to put in their mental health toolbox. But it is a good rule probably for just about everyone who is not always perfect. So the science question is whether or not the masks actually work to prevent infection. And early in the pandemic, one publication had claimed that just because a majority of governors had decided to impose mandates, then that meant it was a good idea. And by early June 2020, according to Pew Research Center, 65% of Americans said they had been regularly wearing masks, and that had climbed to 85% by August of 2020. Did it end the pandemic? Obviously not. And during the construction of the Panama Canal, an engineering feat that had been attempted many times before, science would not have an idea that viruses even existed until the end of the 19th century. And believe it or not, they still had a thought that diseases like yellow fever and malaria were caused by bad air. And so 22,000 people died at the beginning of the 20th century trying to attempt one of the greatest engineering achievements known to man at that time, because they were masking up while mosquitoes engaged in coordinated attacks. Died believing that they were following the science and doing the right thing, just like Pastor Jacobson lost at the Supreme Court under the belief that he was doing the right thing. But he was wrong as two left shoes, as one pastor says. So this provides a good segue to explain our case at the Supreme Court. A lot of folks like Pastor Jacobson certainly have a lot of opinions about facial coverings as to how they work and whether they work. But the proof is not on the news, but in the science reports. And over a decade ago, the NIOSH actually performed what might be called a blue ribbon study, trying to test non-medical grade substitutes with the very same diagnostic equipment that we use to rate protection like the N95, looking at the mask and whether or not it works, not going out and looking at metadata analysis to see this state and that state. And if that study had said that even a bandana could prevent microbial infection, like Doc Ralph Northam said, we would have used that study. But we didn't, did we? No, we had a whole bunch of studies thereafter. Back in June 2020, the WHO commissioned a hasty review of what were called observational studies, recent, going back to May 2020, with no peer review or double-blinded trials or anything that is normally used, and that study was promoted by the Washington Post with a nice headline. Spate of new research supports wearing masks. And if, like most people who only read a news story for about 2 minutes, that is probably the only thing that you knew about that study as a takeaway. And at least at that time, for what was generally known about a novel coronavirus that many believed was being transmitted by small to medium droplets, although now, at least as of May, recognized by the CDC as being transmitted primarily by aerosols. which persist in the air for up to 2 hours, they tell you that masks like the N95 should be effective against COVID-19. But 4 paragraphs down, they also told you, if you read, that the substitutes that you were being mandated to wear, it was a less certainty about how effective they actually were. And in fact, if you actually read the study, even though Dr. Fauci has even recently advised that people try double masking for an extra layer of protection, that study, that scientific study, said that they were not certain that 12 to 16 layer surgical masks would be effective at preventing infection. And they had examined 172 studies from around the world as scientists. When that study failed to satisfy the mark, the Royal Society of London commissioned a study in July 2020 and used the assumption that 1-ply cotton was 98% effective at preventing microbial penetration, better than the N95, 1-ply cotton. But it was just an assumption. It was used to produce a test that could convince people that a bandana might work. But it doesn't. And that is just common sense. Like I said, I spent about 2 decades in uniform, working in the business of force projection and force protection. I took an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And for about 4 years as a reservist, I had a great job as a commander for a basic training unit, where each summer we got a chance to spend about 3 weeks training former civilians how to become soldiers. We taught them how to don a chemical mask in under 9 seconds to protect themselves from contaminated environment, biological or chemical. But at the very beginning of basic training, there was a basic concept that, believe it or not, many soldiers find a little difficulty trying to get right in their heads and understand. The difference between what we call cover and what we call concealment. Now, concealment, which we should know from Halloween, is just like what it sounds. It means that the enemy cannot see you, and that involves a lot of things like camouflage. It may be enough for you to complete your mission. And you probably have a good sense of this if you play video games or have even engaged in paintball battles. But cover, while in most instances, it will certainly conceal some vulnerable parts on your body, is defined as actually being effective at protecting your body from harm to complete that mission and return home to your family, friends, and loved ones, and get on with your normal life. And some might get a good chuckle at that because most tend to believe that soldiers are not really that smart. But the fact is, if you look at the data, and you can read the Supreme Court case about Cassius Clay, who some may know by the name that he chose, Muhammad Ali. Most people believe that he was a fairly articulate and intelligent guy. But did you know that when he had to take the test for the draft the second time, he actually failed the test? And he even told reporters that he said he was the greatest, but never said he was the smartest. And that kept him out of the war until they decided to lower the standards back in the days of Vietnam and the war in Southeast Asia. But here's a fact that you may not know, especially if you believe that soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines are not the most intelligent people. About 75% of age-eligible Americans, about the same number of people who have gotten vaccinated, cannot qualify for military service. And some by reason of criminal record, but 75% of us are not felons. And others by fitness. And 75% of us are not unable to do a push-up. I hope. But the rest of us who can't get into the military are not qualified because they can't pass the test to get in. And it's not really that difficult of a test. I maxed the officer test and the entrance test. And that is a humbling fact. If you thought that you were Wonder Woman or Superman and the smartest person in the world, especially on non-medical grade facial coverings, which are not technically masks. This briefing is unclassified, as you were. My name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for Arlington Public School Board. Let's keep Mike Webb away from our schools. Honest. Carry on. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb. Thuc, I could have had a vaccine.